Great. Well, thank you very much, John, for that introduction. And you'll have to tell me if you can hopefully see my screen and the map of
I can.
Fort William. That's a good start. Thank you. So I'm very grateful to the exhibition organizers for the invitation to speak to you today about one of the National Library of Scotland's maps in this exhibition. And as John implied, this builds on many years of what I would say has been happy collaboration at a personal and institutional level between myself and various people associated with the exhibition. And it reflects too that early maps can be best understood, I think, within a broader context of pictures, views, and other documentary sources. So maps themselves are wonderful things, but inherently dishonest. They select and exclude. They highlight some things at the expense of others, and nearly always were constructed with a particular purpose in mind. And I'd say military maps are in some ways even more dishonest, constructed to aid attack and defense, and it's important to read them in this light. Military maps of Scotland in the 18th century were usually intended to help the Hanoverian forces subdue or threaten native Highlanders. In some ways, they were a confidence trick too, often trying to convince the armies using them that their maps gave them superior knowledge or control of the country, when quite often they didn't. And I've always been fond of this plan, of Robert Johnston's plan of Fort William, drawn into it by its striking aesthetics, its attractive flowing calligraphy, and its such distinctive rendition of the surrounding mountains. Johnston was described as the barrack master and overseer of works at Fort William in 1718. And he was also responsible around this time for drafting two other maps. One of these, which I hope you can see here, from 1717, focuses on the Cairnabur Moor and Beg Islands in the Treshnish Islands to the northwest of Mull. This is in fact our earliest map of these islands, focusing on repairs and leaving a large gun in place to control access to the inner Western Seaway. And at the same time, Johnson also drafted a map of the whole island of Mull, showing the position of the Treshnish Islands up here to the northwest, and also other forts such as Duart down here to the southwest. The soldiers stationed at Fort William were frequently dispatched to these outlying castles. But to properly understand Johnston's Fort William plan, it's useful to say a little by way of background about other maps at this time, a little about the history of Fort William and its owners, the Board of Ordnance, who employed Johnston and had responsibility for the fort. And I think it's hard for us today to understand not only how very limited existing topographic maps of Scotland were in terms of their detailed geography, but also the deliberate political bias that fueled something of the Jacobite resentment of the Union. Following the Act of Union in 1707, influential London-based map engravers began a long campaign to relegate the name of Scotland from maps of the country, clearly underlining the new political geography and focus for loyalties. But they also showed little detail of the country itself. These maps were largely based on the Blaau county maps of a century earlier. This military map of 1718, orientated with west to the top, focusing on the Central Highland, shows the routes connecting the forts of Inversnaid to the top left, with places like Fort William and Fort George in Inverness to the upper right and to the lower right. This detail here focuses in on Fort William. And it highlights quite well, I think, how beyond a few selected locations and the routeways between them, there was a real ignorance of local topography. We're a decade before Wade's initial military roads began to connect some of these places. So let's look briefly at the background to Fort William and the mapping of it. In 1654, General Monk began the construction of Inbelocky Citadel, situated at the mouth of the River Locky. It housed just 250 men. And although the fort was abandoned in 1660, it was rebuilt nearby in May 1690 when General Mackay was given permission to establish a new fort at the site. It was a rush job, with construction completed a speedy 11 days later, just throwing up cheap earthen ramparts and wooden walls, and named in honor of the new king. But it was poorly sited, vulnerable to artillery fire from nearby hills. There were regular proposals to try to resite it and shore up its worst vulnerabilities. And at this time, in the 1690s, John Sletzer, who was principal engineer for Scotland, drew up two proposed plans for the fort. On the left, the design retained the original shape of Inbelocky Citadel, whilst the second proposal proposed a more extensive fort with 3 four-pointed bastions. Sletzer had a tricky time negotiating his loyalty to the new Williamite regime, and obviously felt necessary on this plan to make grand, unsubstantiated claims that this fort formerly contributed much to keep the Highlanders in subjection to the government and in an entire peace amongst themselves. In fact, neither of Sletzer's proposals were followed, and as his successor as chief engineer, Theodore Drury's plan shows, the eventual fort retained the irregular pentagonal shape of the original Cromwellian fort, and the small settlement of Maryborough, named after William's wife, developed outside the defences. By the early 18th century, the threat and reality of Jacobite insurrection in Scotland created real military concerns for the British government, which in turn required new plans of fortifications. Scotland's chief military engineer, Theodore Drury, was particularly involved in proposals to strengthen the major castles, including Edinburgh, shown here, orientated with west to the top, to better withstand artillery bombardment. And this shows a large proposed green defensive work, which would have covered most of the current esplanade. But given the Board of Ordnance's higher priorities elsewhere in Britain and Europe, ambitious proposals like this were never implemented. And you may see creeping in the top of this image here, the Inspector General of Fortification stamp, and on others that we're about to see, the BO, Board of Ordnance stamp. And it's useful to say a word or two about who they were. The Board of Ordnance was first established in the 14th century. Its chief responsibilities were as a principal supplier of munitions and equipment to the Army and Navy. But mapping was a crucial part of their work. And as a result, the focus of their activities was predominantly with maps of fortifications, even though they were also employed in making maps of roads, maps of battles, and even the wider countryside from a military perspective. So following the 1707 Union, the Board of Ordnance reluctantly were given responsibility for Scottish fortifications, but they were always overstretched. There was a much greater priority given to forts in the expanding British territories overseas, and they always hoped, wrongly, that the Jacobites would never pose a serious threat. So when George I ascended onto the throne in 1714, a time of unprecedented popular unrest by the Jacobites, the fortifications in Scotland were in a dreadful condition, starved of funds, men, and provisions. In March 1714, it was estimated that just £20,000 had been spent on Scottish fortifications in the 7 years since the Union, which was just 1% of total Ordnance Office expenditure. It was estimated that £100,000 would be required to complete the works on forts in Scotland. And the military plans we see by Drury and Johnson formed part of a long campaign to try to gain approval for funding repairs and improvements. The Board of Ordnance records at this time demonstrate the board's very impressive skills in the art of procrastination and creative ways of saying no. Scotland was a long way from them in London, and they were primarily focused on European warfare, including what became known as the War of the Spanish Succession. For each Scottish refortification proposal, cheaper alternatives were sought, such as what it would cost for fortifying it to prevent an insult rather than to resist an attack with great artillery. Things were getting desperate. This is the real to Johnson's map. In early August 1714, General Maitland, the commander at the fort, wrote to the board, "We are in great danger of being surprised by the Highland clans. They being all ready to rise, they expect the Pretender to land every day. Hoping you will take this into consideration and form your command." He followed this up a week later. "All the platforms are wholly out of order. A new gate is wanted for the principal port, a new great gate to the Ravelin." This is a triangular defensive work outside the main gate. And new gates to the Sully port. The bridges are entirely out of order. The palisadoes, these are oak beams forming the outer wall all along the River Nevis, are perfectly ruinous. Now, the board's response on the 20th of August, there is no money allowed to this office for carrying on any works in North Britain, cannot have been reassuring for Maitland, and so he tried a new tactic. "I wish some engineer may be sent here to see this place. We are very busy dressing the parapets, planting palisades, and doing all we can to make the best of a bad bargain. I advance the money. Who pays me, I know not. Once more, I entreat you get an engineer sent to see this place and the outposts." Now, this request by Maitland was actually successful, helped by it being the cheapest option, and it resulted in an engineer called Lewis Pettit, an experienced engineer from France who had served the British Board of Ordnance in the European wars, was dispatched to Scotland, certainly spending time in Fort William. And Pettit drafted a plain but fairly utilitarian plan, an elevation of the new storehouse completed in 1712, as well as similar plans of various outposts from Fort William. But Pettit's skills were more as an engineer than as a draftsman, and he left us no plan of the environs of Fort William. So it was left to Johnson to provide us with this wonderful map of the environs of Fort William, particularly useful for showing the surrounding countryside for reconnaissance purposes. And this was very important for organizing patrols into the countryside from the fort, as well as visualizing its location from a defensive perspective. Johnson gives us a view from the northwest, looking across to the fort over Loch Linnhe, with the River Lochie and the Great Glen to the left, and Glen Nevis to the upper left. A later pencil note in the bottom right corner on the plan has C 1710 written on it, but Chris Abraham dates the plan to between 1710 and 20, partly as it depicts some post-1712 buildings, and this also connects better with the little that we know of Johnston. And I would argue Johnson's map is a special one for a number of reasons. First of all, it very cleverly shows the fort itself at a much larger scale than the surrounding countryside. It cleverly magnifies the visual appearance of the fort, dominating over the surrounding area. In the hand of Johnston, this was not some dilapidated wreck of a fort, more of a nuisance to the surrounding Highlanders than any threat, but a visual spectacle, no doubt holding the Highlanders in awe as intended. And as an experiment, I tried recreating something of the same view through our online 3D georeference Viewer draping Ordnance Survey 1-inch mapping of the 1900s over a digital elevation model. And in many ways, the complexity and immensity of the mountains, especially to the south, quickly blur together. Note too that even the whole town of Fort William by this later time is completely lost in this surrounding belief when showed true to scale. And this highlights really what Johnston was trying to do. Secondly, it's the earliest detailed depiction and naming of the settlements within 5 miles or so of Fort William. Timothy Pont's surviving maps don't cover this area, and the Blau coverage is at a very small scale. Johnston's map actually picks out several settlements that were missed by the later Roy military survey that, of course, Paul Sanby worked on. And note too, Johnston's a very attractive handwriting with its very graceful swoops and loops. A third thing to note too is the absence of roads. It wasn't until 1726 before Wade's military road was put in along the Great Glen, and 3 decades before the Caulfield military road from Kinlochleven arrived, wonderfully depicted on John Archer's map shown here of 1750. Fort William was always originally intended to be supplied and supported by sea, in contrast to the new forts that were developed over the next few decades, which were all interconnected by military roads. Fourthly, I think a crucial purpose of Johnston's map was to depict the surrounding terrain. A key role of the military engineers to depict the situation or environs of the fort. The best military engineers or artists who could freely adopt multiple perspectives as necessary. Something of this can be in Richard Lee's mid-16th century view of the Siege of Leith, depicting Leith down here in the foreground with the siege works around it, looking towards Edinburgh and Arthur's Seat in the distance. And it can also be seen in the Moresque and Bastide's view of the new fort of Inversnaid by Loch Lomond in 1718. Military engineers required a range of skills in mathematics, in geometry, in ballistics, in things like the theory of fortifications, and not least in the ability to read the land from a military perspective and to put this reading down in map form. The overhead perspective with which we've become so familiar today involves a lot more work to create, and even in the hands of someone as skilled as Paul Sanby, inevitably loses something of the feel for the landscape. Later military plans of Fort William, such as this one by John Elphinstone, were drawn to scale and with standard colour specifications. But these show the effect of the Board of Ordnance's drawing school developed in the Tower of London from the 1720s. And Johnston predates these developments, allowing much more of his own creative artistry to show through. So Johnston's plan is special, I would argue, for all of these reasons, and like many of the other maps and views in this exhibition, provides us with far more than just an insight into a particular place at a point in time. This map also illustrates the key contribution of the military engineer to Scottish map making and a crucial phase in the longer term mapping and visualizing of Scotland. Just to mention briefly, for more detail on any of this, he says modestly, please consult Scotland Defending the Nation, published in 2018. And just to say thank you very much for tuning in today and for listening. And I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.